Have you ever wondered if the guy or girl standing next to you at the bank or at the store or even on the bus or train might just be a psychopath serial killer? Well, in today's episode we have 3 stories of girls who came terrifyingly close to becoming a famous serial killer's very next victim, and they had absolutely no idea. Now, let's play a game. Let's see how long it takes you to guess who the killers are, and let me know your guess and the timestamp in the comments. Welcome to Severed Soul. Now, let's get on with the stories. In October of 1976, in Gloucester, England, 16-year-old Kathleen Richards was feeling like she really needed a change in her life. Her father had passed away when she was 14, which, is obviously a very traumatic thing for anyone to go through, but especially at an age where you really need that father figure around. Still grieving the loss of her father, and not really knowing what she wanted to do with her life, Kathleen decided to leave home to go and be her own person. In her own words, she said it seemed like it would be a bit of an adventure to go and become an adult. Kathleen had a boyfriend at the time, and he was like, well, my parents have a spare house. There's no tenants in there at the moment, so why don't you just stay there until you can find something else? So Kathleen agreed, and that's where she stayed until it was time to move out. And then Kathleen met up with an old school friend called Anne Marie. Now, Kathleen was talking to Anne about her circumstances. How she needed to leave home, she'd been to stay at her boyfriend's parents' house, but then they needed her to leave. And Anne was like, well, you've come to the right person. My parents literally have a flat available if you're interested. And Kathleen's like, well, yeah, that sounds amazing. Can I go and have a look? So Anne introduced Kathleen to her dad, and he showed her up to the flat. And when Anne looked around the flat, she said it was very basic, but honestly, it was all she needed. And for what she was paying, she couldn't really expect grand luxury. Now, Kathleen said she recalled Anne's mum and dad being absolutely besotted with each other. It was really obvious how much they loved one another. Anne's mum seemed slightly aloof and standoffish, but her dad, well, he was the perfect gentleman, always pleasant and, to be honest, a really good landlord. At first, Kathleen never really got to see too much of Anne's family life. Doors were often kept closed, and Kathleen really just liked to keep to herself, so all in all, it really suited her. And she would say that unless you were invited, you never went into the family area, which, is probably the way it should be. As time went on and Kathleen got used to Anne's family and they got used to her, she would be welcomed more into their daily routines, to the point where she was occasionally asked to babysit for Anne's young brothers and sisters. And Kathleen didn't really mind at all. She would let the children have a little bit of playtime, then it would be straight up to bed. Now, as one of the oldest, Anne was often expected to get the younger kids ready for school, and Kathleen would frequently hear Anne's mum shouting at her because she wasn't doing things right, or she wasn't doing things quick enough, or more specifically, because she hadn't given them water with their toast. To be honest, Kathleen had noticed that Anne seemed to be treated different to her siblings. She was treated far more harshly. Her mother was especially strict with her. In fact, it often seemed like Anne was expected to be more of a mother figure to her siblings than their actual mother was. So, Kathleen would later come to realise that Anne's mum wasn't actually her biological mum, she was her stepmom, which probably explains why she was treated so different. Now, Kathleen's boyfriend would come to stay with her from time to time, and her siblings would visit her. But other than that, she spent a lot of time on her own. She'd see the children when they came to and from school, and on the odd occasion when she was asked to look after them, but that was it really. Now, one evening, Kathleen had been invited to watch TV with the family. Fred was pottering around in the kitchen, and Kathleen and Anne were on the sofas with some of the younger children. The TV was disturbed by the sound of the doorbell, at which point a red light came on behind a curtain, and Kathleen's like, what's that red light area all about? And one of the children said, shh, Mum has her friends in there and we aren't allowed in." But Anne's dad never really seemed bothered by any of these antics. It was just kind of accepted that that's just what she did. They never seemed to argue about anything, to be honest. But that was the first time that Kathleen really grew suspicious that something wasn't quite as it seemed with Anne's mum and dad. One of the other tenants at the house was a girl called Shirley. Now, when Anne's dad first introduced Kathleen to Shirley, he introduced her as his girlfriend, which Kathleen kind of accepted as some weird joke. However, as time went on, it became more and more obvious that this was true, especially when it was revealed that Shirley was pregnant and the father was, of course, Anne's dad. During her time living at the flats, Kathleen and Shirley became best friends. They'd often sit together, staring out of the window, drinking cups of tea, making plans for the future about how Shirley would move out and get her own place with the baby, and how they could meet up at coffee shops for a catch-up. The girls had literally become inseparable. One night, when Kathleen was lying in bed, she could hear what sounded like commotion coming from somewhere else in the house. Now, I found this part of the story quite disturbing, so if you want to skip forward a bit, then please do so now. Heather, one of Anne's younger sisters, who was around 8 years old at the time, could be heard screaming, clearly distressed, "Stop it, Daddy, stop it." Now, it didn't take a genius to work out what was going on, and this was the point where Kathleen decided she needed to get out of that house and find somewhere else to live. So, secretly, Kathleen made arrangements for alternative accommodation and kept it to herself until the day she was ready to move out. She packed her bags and told Anne's dad that she was leaving. Now, Anne's dad was kind of shocked and asked Kathleen when she was planning to leave. And rather calmly and assertively, Kathleen said, "Right now." And that was it, she left. But that decision, the decision not to tell Anne's mum and dad she was moving out, might be the very reason that Kathleen is still alive today. 20 years later, Kathleen was getting on with her life, and she'd mostly put her time living with Anne and her family to the back of her mind. She often thought about Shirley and the child and wondered what they were doing with their lives. Then, one day, Kathleen picked up the remote, turned the TV on, and switched to the news. Now, she instantly recognised the two faces staring back at her from the screen as Anne's mum and dad. But as she watched the events unfold on that TV, as she realised why Anne's mum and dad were on the news, Kathleen sat down, put her face in her hands and sobbed. The body of a young girl called Heather had been found buried under the patio in the garden of a home on 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. Along with Heather's body, the body of a girl called Shirley was found under the floorboards. A further 2 bodies were found in a chimney breast and under the bath. The same bath Kathleen had literally had hundreds of baths in. The dismembered bodies of several other victims had been found scattered under floorboards and buried throughout the garden. All in all, the bodies of 12 victims were found. In February 1994, Anne's dad was arrested on suspicion of 12 counts of murder, and although he claimed that his wife played no part in the killings, she was also arrested. Anne's mum and dad, Kathleen's landlords, would become known as England's most infamous serial killer couple, Fred and Rose West. So, if Kathleen had given Fred prior notice of her intentions to leave, she would almost certainly have been his very next victim. On New Year's Day 1995, while he was being held at HM Prison, Birmingham, Fred West took his own life. He was found hanging in his cell. In November 1995, Rose West was convicted of 10 murders, including her own daughter, Heather. The judge gave her a whole life order, which in the UK means she will never be released. In April 1969, in New York City, Alice Feiring was only 14 years old, and she was having a pretty normal yet slightly annoying day. She was at a bookstore in the East Village to replace a book she'd lost of her brother's. It was a book called The Stranger by Albert Camus. She was standing by the shelves, just a kid with recently tightened braces, feeling, in her own words, really not pretty. She was pulling a book off the shelf when a voice behind her said, "Oh, existentialists." She turned around and saw a man. Now, this man was strikingly handsome, but Alice said that she noticed something immediately. It was his eyes. They could go from really handsome to really sinister in a heartbeat, and she noticed that straight away. The man introduced himself as John Berger. Now, John told Alice that he was a professional photographer. He said Alice had the potential to be a model and he wanted to take her for some photos. Admittedly, Alice had a gut feeling like straight away her instinct told her that this was all just a trick. But John played on her politeness. He said, "Come on, it's 1969, you have to trust people." John told her he loved the red colour of her hair. And Alice, she was 14, she was shy and she really didn't want to seem rude. She had an hour to kill while she waited for her dad to get his hair cut just across the road, and so she agreed to walk with John. Alice was smart though. She told John, "I'm not going into your apartment." So they went up to the rooftop of his building instead. It felt safer being out in the open. He had her do a few poses, and for a minute Alice said John seemed pretty normal. But then they went back down to his place, and that's when everything changed. John handed Alice a stack of Polaroids to look at while he went to the bathroom, and he somewhat nonchalantly told her, "This is my work." So Alice started flipping through the photos, and she just had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Alice felt like she needed to get out, and she needed to get out now. Without a moment's hesitation, Alice bolted for the door, but she hit a wall, literally. The door had something called a police lock, which was like this heavy iron pole that braced from the door through into the floor. Alice was 14, she was a kid, she'd never seen one of these locks in her life, and suddenly it dawned on her, she was trapped. As she was fumbling with the lock, the bathroom door opened, and to Alice's horror, John walked out, completely butt naked. Realising she was trying to escape, John reached for Alice, and Alice is screaming, "Get the fuck off me!" And in a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled survival, Alice somehow slammed that police lock open and sprinted out the door. She made it to the street, shaking, terrifying, gasping for air, but she was safe. However, in a moment of complete insanity, like a moment from a script of a horror flick, Alice did something that only a 14-year-old would do. She realised she'd left her brother's book, the one her dad had given her the money for, and she said she was way more afraid of her dad's reaction to a lost book than she was of the monster in that apartment. So she walked back. She climbed the stairs and she knocked on the door of the man who had literally just tried to trap her. She held her hand out and said, "Book, please." John opened the door, still naked, and just handed it to her. Alice took the book and walked away. She didn't tell her parents, she only told her brother, who told her, "Whatever you do, do not tell mum and dad." And life just went on. 44 years later, in 2010, Alice, who was now a successful journalist, was sitting in a hotel room when she saw a news report about a man being sentenced to death. She looked at the screen and recognised him straight away. That's John. Only his name wasn't John at all. John was just an alias he used to hide his true identity. John's real name was Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer. Rodney Alcala was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Those Polaroids that Alice was looking at were terrifying photos of women who looked distressed, frightened, terrified. Those photos were Rodney's trophies, and Alice very nearly ended up being on one of those photos herself. Years after the incident, when Alice actually went to visit him at Rikers Island to ask why he hadn't killed her, Rodney didn't even remember her. To Alice, this was the most terrifying moment of her entire life. To Rodney, she was just the girl who came back for her book. Rodney eventually died in prison in 2021. On a freezing cold day in 1972 in Seattle, Sotria Kritsonis was just 22 years old and she'd been standing on the corner of Rainer Avenue for almost an hour, just shivering, waiting for a bus to take her to classes in Renton. She was at that point where she was thinking she would do just about anything to get into a nice, warm car. And right on cue, as if summoned from the heavens above, a tan Volkswagen Beetle, or Bug, pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window and said, "Hello, young lady. Are you waiting for the bus?" He told her he'd literally just driven down Rainer Avenue and there was literally no bus in sight. Sotria said the guy was dressed real nice, his hair was kind of wavy, he had these dark eyes. He was a handsome man, and he just seemed charming and friendly. Now, Sotria was desperate, and when he wound down the window, she could feel warmth literally emanating from inside the car. So she thought, well, it can't be any worse in there than it is out here. So she said, "Sure, I'll take a ride, thanks." However, literally, as soon as that car pulled away from the curb, that good Samaritan that pulled over to offer her a ride vanished. And right about here, everything changed. It was like a completely different person had taken over. He started yelling at her like really aggressively. He was shouting, "Why did you take this ride? Why did you even think about taking this ride? You're never going to make it to school." And then he started reaching for something under his seat. Now, Sotria's first instinct was to jump. She knew she needed to get out of this car, even if that meant jumping out of the car while it was moving. So she reached for the door handle to try to open the door, but to Sotria's absolute horror, there was no handle. In fact, the inside of the door had been completely stripped. No handle, no armrest, nothing. Sotria said she felt like she was trapped in a moving cage. She was sobbing, praying, literally pleading for her life. She was thinking, this is it. This is how I die. This man is going to kill me and nobody knows where I am. She kept saying, "Please don't do anything. Please don't harm me." They were driving south on the I-5 towards Tequila, and the driver was just spoiling, screaming like a maniac, yelling at her that she should never have gotten in the car. But then he made a really bizarre demand. He looked at Sotria and screamed, "Take your hat off." Now, obviously, it was freezing cold outside, so Sotria was wearing a little stocking cap just to keep warm. She was confused. She said, "What do you mean, take my hat off? Why?" And the man insisted, "Just take your hat off." I mean, it was a strange request, but clearly this guy was absolutely unhinged, so she did it. She pulled off the hat, and she said she saw him realise that something was different. His facial expression changed. She said it was almost like he looked disappointed. And he instantly demanded that she put it back on. He kept yelling that she was never going to make it, she was never going to make it to school. But the energy had definitely shifted. Well, after about an hour of this terrifying ordeal, the man drove Sotria right to the front of her school, shoved her out of the car onto the ground, and told her she was really lucky. And Sotria, she was embarrassed by what had happened. She told her family, but she didn't call the police. She really just wanted to try to forget about this weird guy in the Volkswagen. Well, just over a year later, Sotria was watching TV when a face flashed on the screen. She said she knew 100% that was the guy. The handsome stranger who gave her a ride that day would eventually be linked to the murders of at least 36 women, many of whom were dumped in the very woods he was driving Sotria towards that day. That man was notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. When Sotria was in the car with Bundy, when he told her to take off the hats, the reason he looked so disappointed was that Ted Bundy had a very particular profile of victim. Young women with long dark hair parted straight down the middle. Well, it just so happened that a week before this encounter with one of the world's most infamous serial killers, Sotria had been to the hair salon and had her hair cut short. And that's the thing that ultimately saved her life that day.
And that's all for today. I really hope you enjoyed those 3 close encounters with serial killers. If you did, go down, drop the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications. Thanks for watching. This is Severed Soul.